Thank you, Hing. Um, I would like to, do you see my screen? It's okay, yeah. I would like to heartfully thank Hing Chao, Roberto Gotti, and Professor Mal Jensen to have put this conference in motion and for allowing me to take a humble part of it. Uh, Martial arts are cultural phenomena shaped by the society in which they develop. They were and still are transmitted through interpersonal exchanges from body to body. Martial arts experts use speech for devising these martial skills into complex systems of bodily knowledge. Once the systems are complex or vast enough to be verbalized, they are transmitted through bodies and speech with mnemotechnical texts such as poems, codified knowledge canons, or a constellation of technical words associated with metaphors or images. Some of these mantras, here I mean mnemonic devices, found their way into writing or depiction. This process is transliteration from speech to the page or to a depiction. The written word or the depiction of bodies fighting on a wall, a painted canvas, or an embedded into a sculpture challenged time and survived the masters who invented them. However, in most cases, those who actually wrote the words, painted the images, or sculpted the stone were not martial arts experts themselves. The documents, depictions, and sculpture preserved for the study of martial arts culture of the past have to be explored while taking into account the perspective of those who created them. Based on previous research and circulation of knowledge in the corpus of European fight books, this contribution allows for a new categorization of martial arts knowledge on and beyond the page, with a focus on early modern fight books. My paper was originally intended as an introduction to European fight book studies. You have heard yesterday a series of great papers addressing issues related to Italian examples of the 15th and 16th century. I would like to take a step back and consider the fight books as a technical genre, literature, and give some thoughts into its role as potential vector of transmission of knowledge. I will do so in presenting Italian examples, but with the Googles of the specialists of technical literature and by widening the scope a bit and address other examples from other regions. By doing so, I hope to give the audience unfamiliar with this corpus of sources a glimpse of the specificities of the European fight books, and also to be taken on a visual tour of selected examples. So, let's start. This is the definition we're working with since a few years. It was published in a 2016 book I co-edited. It outlines that the fight books compose an heterogeneous corpus, meaning that not all fight books are technical manuals about the art of fighting, as the general audience might consider it. It is, however, very specific, and it's not to be mixed with other type of books about fighting, like tournament books, military books, or dueling books. All of the latter do address fighting, but none of them actually attempts to put the embodied knowledge at the center of its discourse like the fight book do. So a few numbers now. I recently published an article presenting a bibliometric study of the corpus from the 14th century as its inception until the first third of the 17th century, when the source material changes and another literary genre appear, the military drill books, in the wake of the major European conflict known as the 30 Years' War. In that time frame, the surviving fight books built a corpus of 187 single works, that is counting all the manuscript and the prints, but not the multiple copies. On the charts, you can see an interpretation of the content and the typology of the manuscript corpus and a map with all the printed books in Europe. The larger the point is, the greater the number of the printed book. You can see that it is in Italy that the greater number for that period of time, when that is in South Germany, which is the area where the most manuscripts were produced. However, this is about surviving copies, right? Which does not represent the actual dissemination of the martial arts practice, as you well know in the past. Due to the great diversity of material, I came up with a working typology, which is summed up in this slide. I will not go here in details, we don't have time, and you can turn to my published work if you're interested. The key idea is that some of these books do not actually represent a vector of understandable embodied knowledge, some other do. In other words, some are didactic, some are not. You have personal notes of martial arts practitioners, which were never intended to be read by others. You have presentation works presented as diplomatic gifts, barely giving any keys or any deeper access to the martial arts knowledge. And you have properly didactic works conceived to actually transmit embodied knowledge. But as you know, the book is not an ideal media to do so. My typology is conceived by using a double criterion based on formal aspects and basic observation of the materiality of the primary sources. That is basically which kind of media are on the page. Is this text only, image, or both? And what is the actual material? So is this a one codical unit or a composition of many others? This will give you a little part of applying these criteria on this heterogeneous corpus helps the researcher with objective tools to sort the 5 books out, but that is just one part of the job. Before starting my visual tour of the corpus, I would like to point a major issue often neglected. That is to identify the role of the actual martial knowledge bearer, the martial expert in the production of the fight book. On this very first European fight book, dated of the very beginning of the 14th century, we can see in the text that the author is complaining on the bad job done by the artist. I quote the English translation. And note that no more is illustrated of this sequence than these 2 figures, which was the fault of the artist. We know that this particular book was a project involving at least 5 hands in the production of image, which were realized first. And the text itself has 3 hands, one being obviously the actual master who had the opportunity to revise this before completion. This is not always the case, and a lot of the surviving fight books are in an unfinished state. So this affects greatly our understanding and interpretation of the material when this aspect is not thoroughly researched before starting any kind of interpretation. That being said, come with me on a visual tour of the different examples, which I categorized with labels intended to allow a dialogue between Asian and European scholars and martial art practitioners. Real men read poetry. As I shortly presented in the beginning of my talk, once a specific martial arts practice has enough practitioner, this system is verbalized. Technical words are invented or reinvented to help the body-to-body transmission of knowledge. Once it is taught, then one would use verses to create knowledge canons which could be passed down more easily. This is what we call transliteration. And some of these transliteration made it on books. The work of Fiore de Liberi is the first Italian example of the fight books, and we have 4 surviving manuscripts attributed to the master dating from 1409 to 1424. On the image, you see that that is way more than just transliteration. This is the Getty version on the left, kept in Los Angeles. And it has technical drawing with prosa commentaries, properly didactic figures for this presentation work. However, on the other versions, you can see on the textual part on the right that you have different elements included in the text part. You have a glimpse of what the original transliteration was that came before the image. Let's translate the verse of the Novati version. I quote, "With this technique, I will put you in the earth and I will probably dislocate the left arm." End of quote. What happens if you only had these verses and not the prosa comments and not the image? And well, that is what happens in the second example. The second example is dated of 1424, Florence. This is an unfinished project of noting down a knowledge canon. This sheet of parchment was later used to protect the quires of a vademecum book for a professional scribe in Florence, 1424. That is, they actually took the piece of parchment to protect what was more important. Nothing in the book actually is connected to martial practice, and you have also the same treatment for another sheet of parchment, which has a recipe for meat sauce bound to protect the next quire. With this, you can actually do very little. These are just pair of verses presenting the names of opposing guards between a master and his student. So if the master is in this position, the student is in this position. We don't even know for which weapon it's meant for, and we have no other surviving document for this tradition. We, however, can guess that this represents a complete martial arts system completely lost to us. Visual mantras. This example was already mentioned yesterday. This is a segno of a follower of your Deliberi, Maestro Filippo Vadi, writing in the 1480s. His fight book contains images and text, series of techniques with different martial disciplines, from fighting in and or out of armor with longsword, axes, lances, dagger, and empty-handed technique, that is wrestling. And in the beginning, it includes this image embodying the martial skills using animal virtues and objects that are named in green in the slide. Powerful visual metaphors conveying a complex embodied knowledge to untaught pupils. German examples show, for instance, to use the technical terms taken out of the rural language for naming guards and position or evocating metaphorical principles for fighting. So this is part of the transliteration and as a knowledge canon, but visual this time. This was addressed yesterday. Some authors use the didactic principle of martial arts forms to be repeated to acquire technical knowledge for implementation in a system of fighting. We discussed this already yesterday, so I will not go deeper, just pointing out that this is not an Italian feature. This is not an Italian feature, but that is also to be found in German examples of the 15th century. Yet, it is comparable to the concept of Japanese kata or Chinese taolu. So this is the earlier version before what you can actually see in the new exhibition, The Way of the Sword. And sorry, the video is lagging. So I would just jump to the next one. Sorry for the time, I'm going really quick. Let's go to the CinemaScope. CinemaScope Camillo Agrippa was always also mentioned yesterday. His printed book in 1553 is a true revolution. With its architectural, mathematical, and geometrical knowledge, the author applied it to the science of human motion, using the latest tools of his time, that is, engraving in metal, copper to be exact, by a very reputed printer with a renowned artist. He managed to go over the limits of the page by using what we can call parataxis, that is, superimposing series of images to emulate movements on a two-dimensional static page. This was only challenged by the invention of serial photography in the late 19th century. But even if this book attracted a lot of attention from scholars, some of its features were overlooked, and a part of its history points us to the opposite direction, a completely unusable book. In 1568, a printer in Venice started to make money printing books, including fight books. Venice, like Frankfurt, Germany, was a major printing center in Europe. It was also a town with increased fencing activities documented. The audience was there and he was making money out of it. He made new plates for engraving, hiring another artist, copying the original printing book, produced only 15 years before the author was still alive. To save money, he asked the artist to combine several images on the same illustration, which he rearranged in the book by modifying the text to refer to the new images. Problem was that what he actually did is degenerating the original content of the book. We know this for this edition of a well-known printed fight book, but some of the other fight book less studied, we do not know for sure if the actual master was involved in or not. For this edition, the master was not. In that case, and in many other, that is not the case. So this book cannot help us to actually understand the actual practice. If we only had this edition without the other, fencing historians would have written a very different history about Agrippa. And my last example is about hyperrealism. Some of the authors of the fight books actually produced works of art. Some decided on purpose not to include images. Maybe also because they did not have patrons rich enough to do so, but some argued that the images cannot help the reader or was not proper to convey martial arts knowledge. Giovanni dalla Gocchie decided to write down his martial system in the format of a dialogue for his dedication work, using only text. This is resonating with the ancient past of antiquity as a reference work for philosophical treatises, for instance, in Greek or Roman ideals. He's actually painting the movements with elaborated words, relying on previous martial tradition of technical words, but giving them literary shape. My second example is a manuscript by Giovanni Antonio Lovino, presented to the King of France. The king actually already gave privilege to a concurrent French fencing master for a printed fight book in France. The Lovinos offers this magnificent, beautifully illustrated and decorated with gold leaf manuscript, stating that the true book for fencing is not a badly printed book with lesser quality, image, and content. So even if the revolution of printing machine actually changed the way to produce and consume knowledge in Europe, the manuscript format was still a very cherished format and a media for a proper work of art. In other words, printed books did not replace manuscript in the late 15th century. Manuscripts were still and still are produced today. To conclude, I hope that I could give the audience a better idea of the corpus of fight books and pointing out that not all of these, as incredible treasure trove they represent, can actually be considered as actual vector of representative martial arts practice. I also hope to have shown that browsing through this heterogeneous corpus from the 14th century to the late 16th century actually requires great precautions before actually entering into its interpretation. One must really first look into the context of its production, and if one can determine the actual role of the martial arts knowledge bearer or the expert in what survived down to us. That requires study and dedication. And as an expert, I can assure you that the field of study of European fight books has a great future, because actually very little of these books have actually been correctly researched from this point of view. There are very little reference work and even little scientific publication laying down the basic tools for the field to grow, including scientific critical editions, which are lacking, for example, for most of the material out there. So we have work to do. Thank you very much for your attention.